Today, we're looking at a pretty major escalation in U.S.-South Africa relations. Specifically, U.S. President Donald Trump's demand that South Africa be removed from the Group of 20. This comes right after his decision to halt U.S. attendance at the 2025 G20 summit, which was scheduled for Johannesburg.
And this action is, it's quite seismic, really. It raises some profound questions about how these multilateral economic platforms are being used or perhaps weaponized. So I think the central question we need to tackle is this. Is this threatened removal of South Africa fundamentally a form of, let's say, sophisticated economic sanctioning? Or is it primarily a mechanism for political condemnation, really aimed at forcing policy changes on specific human rights and domestic land disputes?
I think the actual design of this exclusion, and frankly its inevitable consequence, which is financial devastation that overwhelms whatever political motivation might have come before it. The impact, the mechanism, it's all about economic control.
See, I come at it from a slightly different angle. I maintain that the action is primarily political condemnation. It seems driven explicitly by the stated grievances we've seen regarding South Africa's, let's face it, controversial internal governance issues. The economic fallout, however severe, is really just a chosen and, yes, highly effective enforcement mechanism for a political goal.
Okay, I see why you'd emphasize the political rhetoric, but let's really dig into the functional reality here. The mechanism itself, the act of removal from the G20, it seems designed for profound economic disruption. I mean, just think about what South Africa stands to lose. Immediate difficulty accessing financial resources, and critically, securing debt from major institutions, like the World Bank and the IMF.
Okay, wait, but let's be absolutely clear about why they're threatening this action. In the first place, while the economic ramifications are undoubtedly severe, I agree, the impetus, the explicit reason given for the action, it's entirely political, isn't it? This isn't some general complaint about financial misconduct or instability. No, it's focused on forcing a change in very specific internal policies. We really have to look at the grievance Trump posted on Truth Social. He called it a disgrace, his word, to hold the summit there. And he specifically mentioned human rights abuses, including the alleged killing and slaughtering of Afrikaners, immigrants of Dutch, French, and German origin, and also the illegal confiscation of their land and farms through the controversial Governmental Land Expropriation Act. That's very specific.
Right, but let's trace that linkage back to the financial infrastructure, because that's key. The G20's established core function, going right back to its formation after the Asian financial crisis, is financial coordination. So when you lose G20 status, you lose your seat at the table where global financial policy is actually coordinated. This gives member countries enormous leverage, both political and economic, in their negotiations with bodies like the IMF and the World Bank. So losing G20 status isn't just, losing a club membership card. It means potentially forfeiting access to critical debt restructuring and relief programs, and it immediately jeopardizes trade and investment opportunities. That loss of access to capital and coordination is the sanction. That's the teeth.
That's a compelling point about the financial leverage, certainly. But the political context, I feel, just can't be divorced from the action itself. When you specifically bring up the Land Expropriation Act, which, let's be clear, is highly controversial within South Africa precisely because it deals with addressing historical racial imbalances in land ownership. And you combine that with a specific focus on alleged violence against the Afrikaner minority. Well, you're very clearly trying to exert pressure over profoundly sensitive internal political issues. The desired outcome here isn't cleaner balance sheets for South Africa. It's policy reversal on these specific domestic issues. And that, to me, is the very definition of political coercion. It demonstrates, I think, a use of the G20 platform for non-economic, maybe even moral, and certainly political pressure. It effectively turns an economic club into a tool for, foreign policy interference in domestic affairs.
And this brings us right to that core tension, the function of the G20 versus the mechanism of removal. Okay, yes, the political motivations are clearly articulated, maybe even inflammatory. But the G20's entire relevance, its authority, its power, it's derived from its economic weight. Surely, it represents something like 85% of global economic output. So, therefore, removing a member from a body that is defined by capital and trade ensures the primary, the most devastating, and probably the most enduring impact is felt economically. That's why it works, is the sanction. That's the point of using this particular tool.
I agree the financial fallout is potentially catastrophic. I would never dispute the economic pain involved here. But hasn't the scope of the G20 agenda itself fundamentally, increased over the years? It now includes global health, climate change, even geopolitical conflicts sometimes get discussed. So doesn't this expansion mean its utility as a venue for applying political leverage has grown, perhaps exponentially? The removal threat is explicitly and very openly linked to forcing a change in behavior regarding those specific cited human rights and land issues. Look, if the goal was simply economic distress, wouldn't traditional, more focused sanctions, targeting specific sectors or individuals, wouldn't that be easier, cleaner even? Using the G20 platform, which is also a platform of prestige, seems aimed at maximum global political shaming and strategic coercion focused squarely on domestic policy. And let's maybe break down the difference here between losing influence and losing capital. South Africa's global influence and bargaining power in advocating for issues of regional interest would cease. It even goes further, noting this might leave the African Union itself powerless. Now, that's not just a line item on a budget sheet. This is a profound diplomatic loss, a kind of status stripping that affects global geopolitics. That feels like a political injury that arguably could far outweigh even the immediate financial cost in the long run.
Doesn't the political influence just kind of dissolve almost instantly? The political loss feels like the shadow. The economic stripping is the substance causing it.
Let's just look at the sequence of events here for a moment, because I think it strongly suggests political intent came first. Trump initially announced the U.S. wouldn't attend. That's a clear political slight, right? Then he stated Vice President J.D. Vance would attend, which maybe felt like a slight cooling gesture. But then he reversed that decision to a full halt of all U.S. government officials. This clear escalation of non-cooperation, which was then paired with the comment that he looks forward to unilaterally hosting the 2026 G20 in Miami, doesn't that signal a deep, aggressive political disapproval of the host nation before the full economic sanction is even formally implemented? It seems like this political statement of non-cooperation precedes and actively sets the stage for the economic weaponization.
The halt of attendance is simply an immediate preparatory step. It's applying political pressure, sure, but mainly to demonstrate the seriousness of the sanction threat that's intended to follow. The really significant move is the decision to remove South Africa. That's the true sanction. And regardless of the political wrapper used to justify it, the removal functions by cutting off access to crucial financial instruments. We're talking about debt structuring, securing immediate loans from major global banks, getting the kind of financial resources required for managing internal social crises. The mechanism is entirely one of economic control used effectively to dictate terms to a sovereign nation.
I just don't quite buy that the operational mechanism fully defines the action here, especially when the motivation stated is so specific, so political. The grievances, the explicitly cited disgrace of hosting, the demand to reverse the Land Act, those seem to be the primary drivers. The economic consequence is maximized precisely because the G20 platform provides such a powerful, multilateral way to apply pressure on specific internal policy matters that the U.S. administration objects to. So, to me, this looks like a highly targeted political maneuver that's just using a global economic structure as its enforcement mechanism. It's using economic pain to achieve a very specific moral or political objective.
So, the functional consequence of removal, the immense economic hardship, the very real inability to secure debt, the deep loss of financial integration, all this demonstrates that the action is, in practice, a severe form of economic sanctioning. It leverages the G20's established infrastructure, which is fundamentally about financial policy. The effect is devastatingly financial, impacting everything from infrastructure projects down to daily life.
The severity of the economic impact is simply the tool chosen, a very powerful lever granted, but it's chosen to enforce a primarily political objective. The goal is behavioral change in specific domestic policies, not simply financial isolation for its own sake.
And I think this case warrants quite a bit more consideration of how political grievances, especially those concerning complex domestic disputes and contested human rights narratives, are increasingly being, weaponized through the established frameworks of international economic bodies like the G20.